the sweltering heat of Alabama, 1854, a brutal silence shattered an ordinary Southern household. By dawn, the master's family lay dead, executed not by an intruder but by the very woman they had enslaved. This was not just rebellion. It was a chilling act of vengeance, born from years of cruelty, power, and desperation. What drove a slave, stripped of freedom and voice, to take such a final, bloody stand? And why has history buried her story in whispers? If forgotten stories like this grip you, hit like, subscribe, and share. It helps more than you realize, and ensures we keep uncovering the histories they never wanted us to remember. Chapter 1. Alabama in 1854. Picture the American South in 1854. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, their white blooms swaying under a blistering sun. Alabama was one of the beating hearts of slavery, where human lives were measured in profit margins and the strength of one's back. For the wealthy planters, this was an era of booming riches. For the enslaved, it was an age of relentless suffering, where every sunrise marked another day of labor with no end in sight. By this time, slavery was not just an institution, it was the foundation of Alabama's society. Nearly half the population of the state was enslaved. Laws were written to tighten control. Enslaved people were forbidden to read, forbidden to gather, forbidden even to imagine a world beyond their chains. Patrols stalked the roads, ready to punish anyone who dared to step out of line. In towns and plantations alike, fear hung in the air. Fear of rebellion on one side, fear of the lash on the other. But history is rarely one-sided. Beneath the surface of silence and obedience, a storm was always brewing. Small acts of resistance, working slower, breaking tools, whispering forbidden stories by firelight, were constant reminders that human spirits, no matter how oppressed, cannot be fully crushed. Yet sometimes those sparks erupted into something far more dangerous. And in 1854, Alabama, one woman's quiet suffering would ignite into violence. Her act was not just personal, it struck terror into the entire slave-holding world. Before the year's end, her story would be whispered across the South as a warning. The enslaved were watching, waiting, and capable of the unthinkable. Chapter 2. The woman without a name. History often remembers the powerful. Names of generals, politicians, and planters are carved into stone. But the enslaved, the ones whose sweat and suffering built that world, are left nameless in the records, their identities erased as if they were never fully human. The woman at the center of this story is one of them. We do not know her name. The newspapers of 1854 called her only the Negro woman or the servant. Court records, if they existed, have long been lost or buried. To her enslavers, she was property, not a person. And so history stripped her of the most basic dignity, her name. Yet despite the silence of the archives, we can still imagine fragments of her life. She may have been in her 20s or 30s, strong from years of field work or house labor. Perhaps she bore scars on her back from the whip, or the quiet strength of someone who had endured more than most could bear. She might have been a mother, separated from children, sold off to distant plantations. Or perhaps she was young, unmarried, and constantly vulnerable to the cruel whims of her master's household. What we do know is this: she lived under constant surveillance, without rights, without choices, in a world that insisted she was less than human. But inside her was a fire that neither law nor lash could extinguish. And in 1854, that fire would turn into an act of vengeance so shocking it shattered the illusion of control that slaveholders clung to. She may not have a recorded name, but through her defiance, she carved a permanent place in history, one they tried, but failed, to erase. Chapter 3. The master's household. To understand the magnitude of what happened in 1854, we need to step inside the world of the family she served. The master's household was not just a home, it was a symbol of status. In the antebellum South, wealth was measured in acres of land, bales of cotton, and the number of enslaved people one controlled. A well-kept house, filled with polished furniture and fine china, announced to the community that its owners were among the region's elite. This family fit neatly into that mold. Neighbors would have seen them as respectable, God-fearing citizens. The patriarch, like many planters, likely viewed himself as both businessman and paternal figure to those he enslaved. a cruel hypocrisy that disguised exploitation as responsibility. His wife, at the head of the domestic sphere, would have overseen the household with strict order, ensuring the enslaved servants performed their duties without error. Children, if they were present, grew up learning these hierarchies as natural law, absorbing the idea that some people were born to rule and others born to obey. But inside those polished walls, the power dynamics were stark. The enslaved woman who lived there was forced to wait on the family's needs, perhaps cooking their meals, tending their children, or cleaning their rooms. Every mistake could bring punishment. Every glance, every word had to be measured carefully. For the family, life appeared secure and ordinary. Yet beneath the surface they lived in constant unspoken tension. The fear that the very people who worked their fields and served their meals might one day rise up. In 1854, that fear became a brutal reality. The family's status and comforts could not shield them from what was coming. Chapter 4. The Weight of Oppression. To imagine the world this woman lived in, we must confront the daily brutality of slavery. On Alabama plantations, enslaved people rose before dawn. Their lives were dictated by the crack of a whip, the ringing of a bell, or the orders of an overseer. Work was constant, fields to plow, cotton to pick, meals to prepare, children to tend. There was no choice, no reprieve, no pay. Beyond the labor, there was humiliation. Enslaved men and women were stripped of their legal identities. They could not testify in court, could not learn to read, could not marry legally. Families were torn apart at auction blocks, children wrenched from their mothers' arms. For women especially, there was the ever-present threat of sexual exploitation, a violation spoken about only in whispers but known by all. Punishment was not only physical, it was psychological. The master's authority reached into every aspect of life. A look deemed disrespectful could mean lashes. A small mistake in the kitchen could bring a beating. Even moments of joy, singing, gathering, resting, were watched with suspicion. Fear was the leash meant to keep rebellion at bay, and yet, within this world of relentless cruelty, enslaved people nurtured quiet strength. They created communities in the shadows, whispered prayers for freedom, sang coded songs of hope. But that hope was fragile, constantly threatened by violence. For some, the crushing weight of oppression built slowly, year after year, until the breaking point arrived. For the woman at the center of our story, oppression was not an abstract idea. It was her daily reality, etched into her body, her memories, and her soul. And eventually, the weight became too heavy to carry without striking back. Chapter 5. The breaking point. Every rebellion, no matter how small or large, begins with a moment. A spark. For the enslaved woman in Alabama, 1854. That spark remains hidden in history's silence. No diary records it, no court testimony preserves it. Yet we can trace the outlines of what may have driven her to cross the line between endurance and defiance. Perhaps it was a final insult. A cruel word hurled at her in front of others, stripping away even the smallest shred of dignity. Perhaps it was a beating, her body marked once again for reasons that felt unbearable. Or perhaps it was something deeper, more personal, the violation of her body, the theft of a child, the knowledge that her life would never belong to her. What historians do know is that enslaved people often carried years of silent anger. They endured countless injustices, each one stacking upon the last, until the weight became crushing. The enslaved woman in this story must have reached a point where silence was no longer possible, where obedience no longer mattered, and where fear gave way to resolve. The breaking point is rarely just one moment. It is an accumulation of countless ones. But when it came decisively. She would no longer suffer quietly. Instead, she chose to strike at the very heart of the power that held her captive, her master's family. In that decision, she defied everything the slaveholding South wanted to believe, that enslaved people were passive, submissive, and incapable of violent resistance. Her choice was dangerous, terrifying, and irreversible. It was the act of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The act of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Chapter 6. Night of blood. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The Alabama air was thick with summer heat, the household dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. The family, secure in their routines, had no reason to suspect that death was waiting within their own walls. But for the enslaved woman, this was the night her years of silent suffering would turn into action. No detailed record survives of how it happened. That silence is telling, perhaps deliberate, as slaveholding communities often suppress the grimmest details to avoid spreading fear. But what we do know is this. By dawn, the master's family lay dead. The enslaved woman had executed them with brutal precision. Was it poison slipped quietly into food or drink? A knife taken from the kitchen, its blade turned against those who commanded her every move? Or perhaps a sudden, frenzied attack in the dark hours before sunrise? The exact method is lost to history, but the outcome is undeniable. The household was left shattered, its once powerful family silenced forever. Imagine the terror in those final moments. The cries, the confusion, the realization that their servant, the woman they had considered powerless, was striking back in a way they could never have imagined. For the enslaved woman, this was not a crime of opportunity. It was deliberate, calculated, a message written in blood, that even in chains, resistance was possible. And as the night gave way to morning, the house stood still, no longer a symbol of wealth and order, but of vengeance fulfilled. Chapter 7. Discovery and shock morning in rural Alabama usually began with routine. The crow of a rooster, the stir of enslaved workers moving toward the fields, the first fires being lit in kitchens. But on this day in 1854, the silence was different. The master's house, normally alive with commands and footsteps, remained eerily still. Neighbors and overseers soon realized something was wrong. When the doors were finally opened, the scene inside was horrifying. The master's family, once so secure in their position of power, lay lifeless. The enslaved woman who had served them daily had become their executioner. Word spread quickly. In a society built on the control of enslaved people, news of such violence was not just shocking, it was terrifying. Planters across the county whispered of uprisings. If one woman could carry out such an act alone, what might dozens or hundreds do together? Fear tightened its grip on the South, because this was the nightmare every slaveholder carried deep inside. That the people they enslaved might one day turn on them. For enslaved communities, the discovery was equally powerful, though spoken about in hushed tones. Some may have felt quiet admiration, even hope. Others may have feared the punishment that would inevitably fall hardest on them all. Because in the South, the crime of one enslaved person was often used as justification to tighten control on many. The discovery of the massacre did more than end a family's life. It rattled the very foundation of a society built on human bondage. It reminded both enslavers and enslaved that the lines of power, though brutally enforced, were never unbreakable. And now, everyone in Alabama knew it. Chapter 8. Judgment and Punishment in 1854 Alabama. The killing of a white family by an enslaved woman was not merely treated as murder. It was seen as an attack on the very order of society. The aftermath was swift and brutal. There would be no real trial, no impartial jury, no chance for her to tell her side of the story. In the eyes of the law, her guilt was predetermined the moment the bodies were found. If proceedings were held, they were little more than a formality. Local papers reported her act as monstrous, emphasizing not her suffering but the danger she represented. Judges and community leaders likely spoke of maintaining order, reminding slaveholders of the need for tighter discipline. What they feared most was not her crime alone, but the idea that others might follow her example. Punishment in such cases was designed not only for retribution, but for spectacle. Executions were often carried out publicly, intended as warnings to the enslaved population. A hanging in the town square, or even a swift lynching without trial, would have sent the message loud and clear. Defiance would be met with death. And yet, even in her final moments, there is something hauntingly powerful about her story. She acted knowing what her fate would be. She understood that escape was impossible, that survival was unlikely. Still, she chose to strike back. The South framed her as a criminal. But beneath that framing was a deeper truth they tried to hide, that her act exposed the fragility of slavery itself. Because if one woman could terrify an entire community, then the system they built on fear was never as stable as they believed. Chapter 9. The Buried Legacy. After the execution, the story of the enslaved woman who killed her master's family began to fade, not because it was forgotten, but because it was deliberately silenced. Slaveholding societies had no interest in immortalizing her act. To them, recording it in detail would mean acknowledging the cracks in their system, the possibility that resistance could not be entirely contained. And so, her name was left unrecorded, her life reduced to a shadow in the archives. In newspapers, the coverage was brief, often sensational, and always one-sided. She was described as savage, dangerous, and ungrateful, labels meant to strip her of humanity and justify the institution of slavery itself. What was missing were her words, her perspective, her truth. This pattern was not unique. Throughout American history, the stories of enslaved people who resisted, especially women, were often erased or rewritten to fit the narrative of white supremacy. Their bravery was downplayed, their motives distorted, their legacies left unclaimed. But the silence speaks volumes. The very fact that her story surfaces in fragments, in whispers, tells us how deeply it rattled the society around her. For the enslaved, even if her name was lost, the act itself would have carried weight, an unspoken reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, defiance was possible. Today, when we search the records, we find almost nothing concrete. No trial transcripts, no personal testimony, just echoes of fear in the words of those who tried to erase her. And yet, in that erasure lies her legacy. She unsettled a system so profoundly that the safest response was to bury her story. Chapter 10. Echoes Through Time. The story of the enslaved woman in Alabama, 1854, is more than a fragment of the past. It is a window into the human will to resist, even when resistance seems impossible. Her act shook an entire community, not because of the number of lives it took, but because of what it symbolized, that no amount of chains, laws, or violence could completely erase a person's capacity to fight back. Her silence in the records forces us to ask difficult questions. How many others resisted, only to be erased from history? How many acts of courage were buried beneath headlines that branded them as savagery? And how do we, centuries later, honor the memory of someone whose very name was taken from her? What lingers is not just her vengeance, but her humanity. She was not simply a criminal or a servant. She was a woman, living, suffering, deciding, and ultimately choosing to strike at those who claimed ownership of her body and her life. That choice, however brutal, reveals something undeniable. Enslaved people were never passive. They were thinkers, dreamers, fighters, humans who, in moments of desperation, acted with a clarity born from oppression. Her story echoes through time because it disrupts the neat narratives of Southern nostalgia, the myths of benevolent masters and obedient slaves. It reminds us that beneath those myths were lives filled with pain, resilience, and, sometimes, defiance that history could not completely erase. Even without her name, her memory endures. Not in marble statues or history books written by the powerful, but in the act itself. An act that forces us to confront both the horror of slavery and the unbreakable will of those who lived within it. History often remembers the victors, the powerful, the ones who wrote the laws and controlled the ink. But stories like this remind us that the past was never so one-sided. Even in silence, even without a name, one woman's act of defiance forces us to look directly at the brutality of slavery and at the resilience of the human spirit. If this story moved you, take a moment to keep it alive. Hit like so more people see it. Subscribe if you want to uncover more forgotten histories that textbooks often leave behind. And most importantly, share this video, because sometimes the best way to honor the silenced is to make sure their voices echo across time. Thank you for watching and for remembering with us. Thank you for watching and for remembering with us.